Today's episode is for the 11th day of the month of Teves. We are going to be doing chapter 39, discussing the laws of food that you eat before a meal. Is it included in the blessing that after blessing, the Birkat Hamazon that you say after the meal, or does it require its own after blessing? That's chapter 39. We're going to be doing, there's only 3 paragraphs. We're doing all 3 paragraphs. We're also going to begin chapter 40, which discusses the laws of washing our hands before having a meal containing bread, Netilat Yadayim. And in chapter 40, we'll be doing paragraph 1 through paragraph 4. So chapter 39. By way of introduction, you're probably familiar that before we eat anything, we make a blessing thanking God for that food. And then after we finish eating it, we make another blessing thanking God for the food as well. Different types of foods have their own blessings before and after. Different categories of food at least. Generally speaking, if one is having a meal containing bread, you make a blessing on the bread, and that includes almost everything in the meal, and then you say Birkat Hamazon afterwards, and that also is an after blessing for everything that was in the meal. That's the general rule. We're going to see in a few paragraphs down the road that there are some things that are not included in the blessing that you made on the bread. For example, some types of dessert you have to make a separate blessing for. If someone's having fresh fruit in the middle of a meal, they might have to make a separate blessing for it. But generally speaking, the blessing on the bread, the hamotzi, covers everything within the meal. Now this chapter 39, discusses, let's say I eat something before the meal. I have a snack before the bread. I have a bag of chips. I have some fruit or vegetables. And then after that, I go wash and I have the bread and I start the main part of the meal. So in that case, does the Birkat Hamazon that I say at the end of the meal, does that cover the after blessing for the snack I had before the meal as well, or not? It does get a bit technical, so I apologize for the technicalities. The simplest way to avoid this whole issue is if you're going to be having a meal, don't have anything beforehand until you have the bread. But the next 3 paragraphs are talking about, let's say you did eat something, what do you do or how do you deal with it? Paragraph 1 is going to discuss general foods and drinks. Paragraph 2 is going to discuss wine, or other drinks or foods which we eat to stimulate an appetite. And paragraph 3 is going to discuss foods that are made out of the 5 grains, cookies, crackers, cake, things of that nature, which are made out of either wheat, barley, spelt, oat, or rye, which have the blessing of mezonos. So paragraph 1 says the Shulchan Aruch that if you eat food before the meal, just as a way of an example, let's say you're having some peppers. You're having some red pepper before the meal, and you plan on having red pepper in the middle of the meal as well. So before the meal begins, you sit down to your plate of red peppers. The blessing on red pepper is Beri Pri Ha'adama. Thank you, God, for creating fruit of the ground, vegetables. You eat your red pepper. Then you get up to go wash for bread. You wash your hands for bread. You sit down. You make hamotzi, eat a slice of bread, and now the red pepper is in the middle of your meal also. So are you supposed to make a blessing after you finished your red peppers before you washed your hands for hamotzi, before you washed your hands for bread? If you're not having red peppers during this meal, then certainly you should have made a after blessing after those peppers. But since you're having peppers in the meal also, and your Birkat Hamazon, the after blessing that you're going to say at the end of the meal for bread is going to include the peppers that you had during the meal, there's an opinion that says it also includes the peppers they had before the meal. Therefore, says the Shulchan Aruch, because it's not clear what the right way to do is, you should make sure that if you're having a snack before the meal, first of all, it's best just have the bread first, make the blessing on the bread, and then have everything else you're covered. But if you do end up having some peppers as a snack before the meal begins, then you should make a blessing after you finish that snack, and don't have that same type of food within the meal. Because since you're not having it within the meal, everyone agrees that the Birkat Hamazon at the end would not cover something you ate before the meal. But let's say you did. Let's say you had those red peppers before the meal, and you have red peppers in the middle of the meal as well. So in that case, you are supposed to do an after blessing on the peppers. You're in the middle of the meal now. You're like, oh, I didn't make an after blessing on those peppers I had earlier. You make a bri nefashos as an after blessing for the peppers, and then when you bench, you'll bench, and that'll include everything else when you do Birkat Hamazon. The exception to this, says the Mishnah Berurah, is that there are some items, which I mentioned briefly in the introduction, which require a separate blessing within the meal. For example, it depends exactly how it's set up, but sometimes if you're having fresh fruit in the middle of the meal, then you have to make a blessing on it. So if you're in that scenario, let's say you have fresh fruit before the meal, and then you have bread, and then you have fresh fruit within the meal, the blessing that you made, normally you have to make a new blessing on these fresh fruit, generally speaking. But since you made a blessing on the fresh fruit before the meal, you don't have to make a blessing on the fresh fruit during the meal. And says the Mishnah Berurah, because the blessing on the fresh fruit before the meal, that counts for the fresh fruit eating in the middle of the meal, and the bircha hamazon that you're going to say at the end of the meal counts for the fresh fruit they had in the meal, that ties it all together, and that bircha hamazon at the end of the meal could also go back on the fruit you had before the meal began. I'm sorry, I know this is a bit technical. I'll repeat it again one more time. If you don't get it, don't worry. It does get very technical and nitty-gritty, but let me just repeat it once more. The best case scenario is first have your bread and then have the rest of your foods. Don't have anything before you have bread. Next, let's say you do eat something before you have bread. Then when you finish eating that item, then say your after blessing for the item, start your meal, and in your meal don't have that same item. Let's say you did have that same item in the meal, you had this snack beforehand, and now you have the same exact item within the meal itself. Then do you make a separate blessing now, on a separate after blessing on that item that you ate before the meal or not? So here's where it depends on what type of thing you ate. If you ate something which you would have had to make a blessing on if it was in the middle of the meal, for example, fresh fruit, then you do not have to make an after blessing on that. Your bircha hamazon at the end of the meal covers all of the fruit that you ate, whether it's before the meal, the middle of the meal, you're good to go. If the item that you ate is something that would not require a blessing in the middle of the meal, for example, red peppers, well, if you have red peppers in the middle of the meal, you don't make a separate blessing on it, then in this case, you do need to make a bri nefashos, an after blessing for the red peppers they ate before the meal. Now you'll have red peppers in the middle of the meal, and then the bircha hamazon will cover, like regular, everything you ate during the meal. Paragraph 2. Let's say someone is eating something before the meal, which is meant to stimulate their appetite. The example that Kitzur Aruch gives is a cup of wine. You're drinking a cup of wine, so it's to stimulate the appetite, get you in the mood to eat. So there are opinions that say, even though you're eating this before the meal, because the goal of this is that you could eat better or eat more fully during the meal, it's very much attached to your bread meal. And therefore, your after blessing that you say at the end of the bread meal should include this item that you ate before the meal began as well. Even in this scenario, there are different opinions about it. Therefore, specifically with the case of wine, the Kitzur Aruch says, if you're having wine before you have bread, so you have your wine, you then have your bread, you then say bircha hamazon. After bircha hamazon, have some more wine, and then you say the after blessing on wine, which will include the wine that you had before the meal began. The Mishnah Berurah gives a different solution, and he says a solution by kiddush, because we do every single Shabbos meal. We'll make kiddush in a cup of wine, and then have the bread, and then start the challah, start the meal. So he says when we're making kiddush on wine, if we're having wine before the meal, we should have in mind, at the time that we're making kiddush, the bircha hamazon I'm going to say at the end of the meal should go back on this wine also. And that takes care of the problem. If from the beginning we had that in mind, then we're good to go, and no extra after blessing is required for this wine. So again, just to summarize paragraph number 2, if a person's having wine before the meal, and then they're going to wash afterwards, like we do with kiddush every single week on Shabbos, then as you're making kiddush, have in mind that the after blessing from a meal, the bircha hamazon, is going to go back on this wine as well, and then your bases are covered. Paragraph 3. What about things like cookies, cake, crackers, things which are bread-like, but they're not? But we don't make hamutzi on them for various reasons, and they don't generally get their bircha hamazon for various reasons that we'll get to down the road. So in this scenario, says the Kitzur Aruch, that the halacha is that bircha hamazon could cover a food item which we normally say al hamichya on. Al hamichya is what we say after bread, cookies, cake, things of that nature. So if a person has bread, cookies, cake before the meal begins, then everyone agrees there's no separate after blessing for that cookie, cake, crackers, pretzels, anything of that nature. The bircha hamazon at the end of the meal covers that, even though you ate it before the meal. Paragraph 40. Washing our hands before having a meal of bread. So as you are likely familiar with, before we have bread, we wash our hands, netilat yadayim. We do this anytime we have bread. Some people think we only do it on Shabbos before we have challah, but really anytime we have bread on a random Tuesday, we're having a sandwich, we're supposed to wash our hands, this netilat yadayim, before we begin. And the reason why we do that is because in temple times, the laws of many types of foods are only able to be eaten in a state of ritual purity. And there was a concern that our hands might be ritually impure, and therefore, it goes back, I believe, to King Solomon actually. He decreed that whenever we have bread, we always have our hands washed. That way, we won't accidentally end up eating food that could only be eaten in a state of ritual purity. We won't end up eating it when our hands are not ritually pure. So it doesn't make a difference whether this food does really require it, does not really require it. You're having bread, you wash your hands beforehand. That way, we don't accidentally make any mistakes. Nowadays, no food that we have has to be in a state of ritual purity, or no food that we're eating at least. Therefore, you would think that nowadays you shouldn't have to wash our hands. But then it says, nope, we still wash our hands now. You know why? Because hopefully one day, tomorrow, later today, Mashiach is going to come. And we're gonna have to, and then we're gonna be having foods that we eat only in a state of ritual purity, and we have to know how to do that. We have to be used to doing that, and therefore, we even nowadays when we don't have a temple, we don't have Beis Hamikdash, we don't have those special foods that have to be in the state of Tara of ritual purity. We always want to be prepared for it, so that when it does happen, God willing, very soon, we'll know how to do it on the spot. We won't then have to learn a whole new system. Paragraph 1. Like we said in the introduction, if somebody is having some bread, before eating the bread, we have to wash our hands, and we recite the blessing of Asher Kedishanu Musav Sivanu. Thank you, God, for this mitzvah of Al Nitalas Yadayim, of washing our hands. How much bread requires washing our hands beforehand? So the answer is, no matter how small piece of bread you're having, you have to wash your hands. It could be a little crumb, you have to wash your hands. But you only make a blessing if you're having the size of a kazayas, according to our Moshe Feinstein at least, which is approximately the size of the volume of 1 fluid ounce. You're having that much bread, you have to wash your hands with the blessing. If you're having a drop of bread less than that, then you still wash your hands, but no blessing is required. Really, it's best to have an egg-sized volume of bread, which is approximately the volume of three fluid ounces. But if you already have the volume of 1 fluid ounce, you do make a bracha already. You make a blessing along with your washing of your hands. Paragraph 2. What can you use to wash your hands with? Do you just turn on the sink and put your hands under the water? The answer is that nope, it has to come from some sort of cup, some sort of vessel. And the vessel is only considered a vessel up to where it can hold water. So if you have a cup that's totally even top, that's the best. If you have a pitcher that you're using to wash your hands with, and the pitcher has a spout which is either lower than the top of the pitcher, or sometimes you have a spout which is a little bit higher than the top of the pitcher, that could create complications beyond the scope of our discussion, and therefore I recommend not using such a pitcher to wash your hands with. If the spout is equal to the top of the pitcher, then it wouldn't be a problem at all. This cup or whatever vessel you're using, whatever utensil you're using to wash your hands with, it can't have any holes in the sides, it can't have any cracks, it has to be a complete full vessel that's holding water. Paragraph 3. If this cup is not able to stand by itself, then there are some times it would not be considered a valid cup to use to wash your hands with, and therefore, even though it might work sometimes, I recommend just staying away from it. Don't use such a cup. If it can't stand on the counter by itself, don't use that cup to wash with. Paragraph 4. What's the minimum amount of water that you need to wash your hands with? So the strict halacha is that you need a revius of water. A revius is approximately between 2.9 and 5.1 fluid ounces. But if you're using that exact amount, there are a lot of halachic difficulties that arise if you use that exact amount, exactly how to do it. And therefore, you should just use a generous amount of water, and your bases are covered, you're good to go. The way it works is that we pick up this cup, we pour it twice over our right hand, 2 times over our right hand, and then 2 times over our left hand. There are some people that have the custom of doing it 3 times in each hand. Chabad has a custom, I believe. There could be others. So if that's your custom, do it that way. If not, twice over each hand is enough. You have to make sure that you're washing your whole hand, the front and back of your hand, and up to your wrist. So you wash it once over your whole hand. You turn your hand a little bit in the middle to make sure it covers your whole hand, up to your wrist. A second time over your whole hand, and then you do the other hand. Once up to your whole wrist, second time up to your wrist. This concludes today's episode. Have a wonderful day, and see you on the next episode.